Good evening, everyone. My name is David Chariandy, and I'm a writer and critic who works in the Department of English at Simon Fraser University. And I would like to begin this evening by acknowledging our presence upon the unceded ancestral territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I would like to offer you a warm welcome to Migration or Escape, Journeys to Sanctuary, an evening co-presented by SFU's Van City Office of Community Engagement and SFU's Institute for the Humanities. Together, through the work of esteemed artists and scholars, we will be exploring the complex and urgent question of migration and involuntary displacement, both of the past and the present. We will participate in a conversation that interweaves scholarship with creative practice, that addresses the shifting dimensions of imperialism, nationalisms, and global capitalism, and that confronts, among other difficult questions, the archive and how innovative and critical engagements upon this complicated the archive, may cast precious light upon those trapped today in conditions of precarity. The format for tonight is as follows. Oh, and I should, this is in fact very important. Just direct your attention. Many of you may have seen the display as you walked in. Welcome House is here. They're putting into practice many important things, doing the type of work that needs to be done regarding refugee resettlement in Canada. And I urge you to pick up pamphlets. Unfortunately, they're not able to stay until the very end of the presentation. So if you are interested in finding out more about the important work they do, please get up and get a pamphlet and come back to your seat. So just the format for this evening. We're going to hear individual presentations from each of the four panelists. I'll welcome them up individually and offer a brief bio and ask them to offer a presentation. And then after, there'll be a panel discussion among the presenters, and then a Q&A period with the audience. And I think this was envisioned as precisely that, a discussion, and I hope everyone will have a chance to join. So I'll begin by introducing the first presenter, Pinder Dulai. Pinder Dulai's critically acclaimed poetry collection, Dream Arteries, published by Talon Books, was published in 2014. He is the author of two previous collections of poetry, and Dulai was this year's co-convener of Sound Thinking 2015, the 2015 Voicing in the City in Verse. I'm sorry, I'm running all of the things together. What is it? Sound Thinking. Sound Thinking. Okay. I'm sorry, I think I may have run all of the lines together. Sound Thinking, which occurred in 2015, Voicing the City in Verse, Reading Surrey and the Super Suburb. He recently collaborated on a sound installation called The Grove, a spatial narrative with artists Carmen Paplea and Andrew Lee for the Surrey Art Gallery. His most recent work has been published in Canada and beyond, Canadian Literature and Q Books anthology, and in new poems forthcoming in e-magazine Ducey. He is currently touring Dream Arteries and is giving talks and readings locally in Kelowna, Calgary, as well as in the US, in Dallas and Austin, Texas. His next series of readings from Dream Arteries are scheduled for this winter at the University of Toronto, the University of Western Ontario, and the American Writers' Workshop in New York City. Dulai is a co-founder of the Surrey-based interdisciplinary contemporary arts group, the South of the Fraser Inter-Arts Collective. I love the acronym SOFIA. Please welcome Pinder Dulai.
Hello, good evening. Thank you so much for making this evening as part of your program, and look forward to an interesting conversation. Just 1 second, I'm going to try to figure out how we manage the computer along with the...
So, which one is yours? Is this one possibly this one? Do you want to start the first slide now?
Not yet.
Okay, so you can just press from there, and then you can start.
Okay, thank you so much. Just before I begin reading from Dream Arteries and speak to some of the thematics of the book and of the relationship to the archive, I just wanted to kind of do what I never do, which is try to kind of make some observations about some theoretical spaces that I've been thinking about. And I think this is probably true of a lot of writers, in that we probably have a lot of theoretical threads that we kind of work with, that we kind of that are kind of in competition with each other in our minds as we try to kind of create poems. Because at the end of the day, theory, I don't think, actually makes a poem. Life makes a poem, but we are influenced by theoretical frameworks. And one of the things that is being kind of on my mind is some of the readings that I've been kind of engaged in is this idea of archival materialism. And I got the idea of the language and the word of it from Dr. Wolfgang Ernst, and specifically he's a media archivist and media archaeologist, critical thinker. Some of the materials that I've been reading from him has been part of a keynote address that he provided and gave. It's called Technologies of Tradition Between Symbolic and Material Transmission, given in 2012 at the Norwegian Research School. What I really wanted to kind of think about in that context is he speaks about unearthing or dislocating a linear, colonially constructed archive and moving it into the online and virtual space. And there's kind of a exploration of that rupture and that movement into a space that doesn't have anything other than binary codes and the kind of limitless kind of universe of the virtual realm. And I thought about that, and he has a very traditional kind of view of what archival materialism is. And in that context, I mean, it's really about the linear space of the archive being constructed by the colonial context as we know it in terms of contemporary archives, whether they be public records, whether they be private collection archives, private collection records, and then considering our public bodies that continue to frame the archive in that space and collect the archive. So that's really where that traditional view of the archive comes from, or as I was saying, archival materialism. But actually, for me as a writer and as a poet, it actually has the potential to frame something else and to transcend that kind of the historicism of the archive into a more living space, and that space of unearthing and disrupting colonialism and kind of breaking it away and then fragmenting the archive and fusing that archive or the documents of an archive into things like creative writing or creative text generation. And so that's what it kind of means for me. And so I've been kind of thinking about this because to summarize what he's been saying, when material records are electronically scanned and excised and placed into a contemporary virtual frame, Ernst considers the emergence of a new archival repository, the fluid, ungrounded, and unframed expanse of the online repository. What agency does this mode of technology provide, considering that this serves as a rupture in a linear mode of documentation to render the body of the work anchorless and generated through computer coding and binary formations? I've been focusing on this because I think that the way I kind of used the archive in Dream Arteries was to fragment it and to actually consciously then put it in a frame or interweave it into the poetic space. And so for me, it's been kind of a powerful space for considering how one relates and how one is relational to an archival space. So for me, it brings meaning in terms of it not being a continuous, single, sustained maintenance of colonial ideals. Some of those ideals being the subordination of colonized subjects into very real stigmas and stereotypes that are living in terms of contemporary society. So in some ways, those frames can be very racialized and are racialized, whether you be Chinese, Black, South Asian, Punjabi and male, like myself, Middle Eastern, and what is presented a century ago sustains itself even now. So in that context, archival materialism then becomes something a bit more progressive for me. It's really about, it's about working towards a dialectic to truth-telling, and the idea of truth-telling and looking for modes of telling truth without relying on public records or relying on what is considered to be factual records. And it's in the context of truth-telling that I'm going to begin reading from Dream Arteries, because that's really where I've found one mode of looking at the colonial context as it relates to refugees, as it relates to migration, as it relates to those big themes of journey, exile, disrupted identities, the containment of colonial subjects in a new imperial context, which is global capitalism. So that's kind of the reference points that I'm using. So I'm just going to see if I can demonstrate for you what I've just spoken about. So this is an rare archival image of a ship called the Ss Stubenhook. I first began looking for the Ss Stubenhook's image. I began in Library and Archives Canada. I went to the Ellis Island Historical Society site and became a member there, and I looked for it there. There was a reference to a Stubenhook to the Peabody Museum online, so I went there. I didn't find any reference, I couldn't source it, and then I moved over, and then there was a reference to the German Maritime Museum. So the Ss Stubenhook is a ship that was built in 1890, and it eventually became the SS Kamagatumaru that sailed into Vancouver. And so this is a very rare image that's in the collection of the German Maritime Museum. And it was first built in 1890, and it was built on the Clyde River in Glasgow, Scotland, for the Hansa Line, which was an international packaging company. But if anybody knows their history, a lot of those packaging companies were also bringing new migrants to the world, the New World. And really, I kind of reflect on some of that truth in the book, and that's the context that I'm kind of writing from. A ship's story. I was born in the yards of Scotstoun shipyard, launched into the Clyde River and given a German name. The straight funnel of my body threaded skywards by taut cables webbing heaven-bound, my body a glory of black steel. I moved at the fastest pace then. I am old now, and my sojourn near the end. For this voyage, my new master purchased a second life for me. The old world exhausted me. I had already made more than 92 crossings between two worlds. In the new world, my usefulness was extinguished. Tomorrow I will become the parts of the sum, feeding the salt water, the debris that was my body. Each part of me I will offer to the unloved. In hope, my words will be made complete, whole for another life, while my life escapes me. If you were to admire me then, do so when I was beautiful and strong. Do so when my name was young. Do so even now as I return the unloved, delivering them to the rifles, the lathis, and the jails of Britain's Bharat. So that's a ship's story. The next poem is a bit of a play on the word Stubenhook. Stubenhook is actually just a little neighborhood in Hamburg, and that's where the primary home berth of the Hansa Line ships were between 1890 to 1907. It's really interesting to kind of think about this, that this other place in another time brought migrants, thousands of migrants, desperate migrants, to the New World. Dies storik haken, this stubborn hook. We moved back against the clock on the high tide, our destination, my new life. On the quiet waters that kiss the bank of the Elbe, I understand now my body will carry the world. The river swallows me whole into commerce. We arrive as the day passes into evening. The port city's hand before me, a sepal of fingers close in. As my guide threads me through this bulbous foci of business, waterways thick with human capital, the port opens up to me, the wharf and each berth a perfection of design. My body slowly eases into my transient home, my nautical journey just now beginning. Those looking for a respite will be my friend. I will carry each burden for tomorrow and the days after. So this is another image of the Stubenhook. It's actually accessed through the Ellis Island Historical Society. So Ellis Island was one of the sites, one of the ports that it made for call, and it was really at Ellis Island that many thousands of European immigrants came to the New World. So I sourced this from the Ellis Island website. It's called the Cecilia at this point. And again, it's the same ship that carried the passengers from Punjab, named the Kamagatumaru. My name is Cecilia. You called me Savior once. Archival note, record note. Rusted tin box found snagged at the end of Wakanai North Sea Wall, Hokkaido, Japan, in 1995. Archival note KM file 10038, HKS 95. Contents revealed. Item inside the box, sealed letter, opened and entered as record. For tomorrow, then, and the days after. To my friend Ellis. Ellis, my friend, you have a rotund capacity for irony. You are kind enough to remember me from before. Sometimes you listen to my weariness. If you were to ask the question who they were, then I would tell you clearly who they were. Russian and Ukrainian families swathed in scarves and patriarchs with stiff straw hats and hard eyes, families escaping unspoken pogroms, losing their old names. Solitary Greek and Italian boymen, ready-made laborers walking into tomorrow's progress in the corner end of a New York moment. Ankless, unknown citations misidentified, women, men, and other, always an invitation to invention and lineage. Young women, eyes glisten against the spectacle of arrival, departure, arrival. The emptied out lives of the recently widowed and orphaned, One remaining family member leaving behind graves and grave names with no bodies, while deep in the hills the moldering ash marks a dead disease. Whole reconstructed families find the dark hull the last sanctuary, rusted and ready, homes on stone pavements, the smoking walls of Marsovan, evacuated homes, dust prints towards the desert, the trek that conjured up dreams of bayonets and axes and execution, names removed from lives, silence brought to lips, an erasure of neighborhoods during the summer heat. Each loved survivor arrived in Le Havre, Samsun, Smyrna, stepped into my body, papers full with fiction and fact. Names true and less true, anonymous and deceased ones now with new life. And those who survived, Agopian, Fernagian, Malhassian, Mardikian, Takulian, a manifest ship laden with fact, fiction, and forgetting. One or more lost, driven, seeking solace of an emptied mind, tear ducts swollen, salt water for the journey. On arrival at the center, many asked, Northnicity, blank, gained amnesia, disembarked into a future. So, let's see here. And this one is the SS Kamagatumaru in the harbor in Vancouver. 26 years later after it was built, after the countless journeys it had made, the ship was leased to by Gurdit Singh, who was a Singaporean businessman, but was also keen to challenge Canada's exclusionary laws. So I'll just read. I'll read this one here. The redness of things. 6 hands with scarlet fingers, dusk, shapeshifts turn crimson at night. A martyr chooses the dark path to the gallows. Sanguinary and precise, the horizon steeped in a wrist-filled sunset seeps into the quiet waters. Today will be yesterday, and the world will be tomorrow, and the future unfolds without my hand. The hull now dusted with an orange swath of pocked skin, scab flakes trail in the cliffed ridges of an after wave. Okay, I think I'm going to stop here at this time. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Pinder. I'd like to invite Dr. Anisa Marwani to the podium. Anisa Marwani is an associate professor of sociology and the inaugural chair of the Law and Order Society program at the University of British Columbia. Dr. Marwani works in the fields of critical theory and colonial legal history and has published widely on law, colonialism, and legal geography. Her first book, Colonial Proximities, details the legal encounters between indigenous peoples, Chinese migrants, mixed-race populations, and Europeans in late 19th and early 20th century British Columbia. Her second book, Across Oceans of Law, forthcoming from Duke University Press, is a global and maritime legal history of the Japanese ship Kamagatumaru. The book draws on oceans as method to trace the ship's 1914 route across the Pacific and Indian Oceans to advance the arguments that legal forms of colonial and racial violence are deeply entangled, and to consider time as a critical register of empire. With Isa Hussein, she is the co-editor of The Travels of Law, Indian Ocean Itineraries, published in Law and History Review, 2014. In 2015, she received the Killam Prize for Graduate Instruction a Dean of Arts Faculty Research Award, and was named a Wall Scholar at the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies. Dr. Anisa Marwani.
It's all right. It's good. So I'd like to begin by thanking Pinder and Joe Hall for organizing tonight's panel, and especially to Pinder for inviting me to be part of it. It's really increasingly rare to have these sorts of opportunities to be in conversation with artists and activists, and in settings that are sort of bringing different institutions together and challenging disciplinary boundaries. So I'm really grateful to be here. So I'd like to start my paper with two pauses. Both are intended to be tributes of various kinds. The first is a dedication to Helen Anderson and Faride Afshar, who is the mother of Manal Matani, who is also supposed to be on this panel but couldn't. Two remarkable women who passed away in late January and early February, respectively, and within 2 weeks of one another. Both experienced struggles of migration firsthand. Both fought racial exclusion in their own ways. After completing her Master's of Education at UBC, Helen was finishing a PhD at the University of Warwick, where she was studying the racial effects of Canadian immigration law. The second pause is also intended as a tribute, though it commemorates people I have not met, the tens of thousands of migrants who have died at sea. It seems only appropriate at a discussion on migration or escape, journeys to sanctuary, that we offer a moment in which to acknowledge the desperation, devastation, and deaths at sea, to remember the bodies that have accumulated and continue to accumulate along the Mediterranean, South Pacific, and elsewhere, bodies that have become abstracted as numbers. To date, the most visible of these deaths is that of Alan Kurdi, a 3-year-old boy from northern Syria whose body washed up on the shores of the Greek island of Kos in early September. Although Alan's photo went viral on social media, and I'm not going to show it here, foregrounding in a single image the inhumanity of the refugee crisis and catalyzing individuals, organizations, and nation-states to assist Syrian migrants, including Canada, thousands of other deaths remain unremarked and unnoticed, archived abstractly and tentatively in body counts. Alan was given a face, a name, and a history, but for the tens of thousands of refugees fleeing the violence in Syria, North Africa, and elsewhere, their deaths have become part of a faceless, nameless mass of bodies swallowed by the sea. Bodies vanished, bodies lost. So I'm not actually going to talk about the archive in any explicit way, although I am a colonial legal historian and I have written about the archive and draw extensively on archival materials. But I would like to sort of think about the contemporary moment by thinking about the past. As a colonial legal historian, it's difficult for me not to refract our contemporary moment through other histories of the sea, those produced through transatlantic slavery, Indian and Chinese indenture, and free migration. That was not really ever free. Migration that was and is the product of colonial occupation and imperial rule of various kinds and in multiple forms. This evening, I'd like to join the discussion by speaking briefly to some of these other histories. And in my book, Across Oceans of Law, I do try to draw together histories of slavery, indenture, and free migration. But today, I'd like to just focus on the journey of the Kamagatumaru. As we've heard from Pinder, the Kamagatumaru was a British-built and eventually a Japanese-owned ship. And this is one that I've been researching and writing about now for 7 years across 3 different continents, so looking at archives in India, in the UK, and in Canada. And these are interests that I share with both Pinder and Melanie, so it's really great to be in conversation with them. Given the events unfolding along the Mediterranean, it's difficult not to think about the Kamagatumaru's passengers. The voyage, which took place 101 years ago, echoes so much of what we're witnessing today: escape from colonial violence and shattered dreams of a new life worth living. To be clear, I'm not drawing equivalences between today's migrant deaths and the Kamagatumaru's voyage. Rather, I want to highlight struggles over maritime jurisdiction that were as potent in 1914 as they remain today. In 1914, the Dominion of Canada drew and fortified jurisdictional lines to assert their claims to national sovereignty and to deport the Kamagatumaru from Vancouver Harbour to Calcutta. Today, jurisdiction has been mobilized in other ways that are equally devastating. Australia, for example, has continued to hold migrants on Nauru and Papua New Guinea as a way of retracting its territorial borders, as a way of absolving itself of any responsibility for migrant deaths on shore or at sea. And this is what I'm calling death by jurisdiction, the ways in which legal lines drawn in the sea are used to relinquish Western governments of their responsibilities to migrants and to migration, the same governments that have been directly responsible, if not complicit, in the dispossession of thousands of people. Before I turn to the Kamagatumaru and to migrant deaths, let me first sketch out the contours of death by jurisdiction through a brief discussion of the sea as legal history. And this just gives you a sense of the maritime significance of the Kamagatumaru's journey. Since the early 17th century, oceans have been the subject of multiple and competing claims to jurisdiction. In 1609, Dutch jurist Hugo Grotius published the monumental Mare Liberum, translated as the Free Sea. Grotius was commissioned by the Dutch East India Company to assess the legality of the Dutch capture of a Portuguese carrack, the Santa Catarina, which occurred at the mouth of the Johor River in the Strait of Malacca, a region that Portugal claimed ownership to. In Mare Liberum, which was initially published anonymously and which would become the 12th chapter of one of Grotius's major works, Grotius concluded that the Dutch capture was legal as the seas could not be owned by any one imperial power and were held in common to all. In a beautiful reflection on the material properties of the sea, Grotius claimed that the high seas could not be possessed, yet he reached the very crucial acknowledgement that they were subject to overlapping and competing jurisdictional claims. These were most evident in the movement of ships that flew under particular flags as sovereign representatives. The high seas were distinct from coastal waters. In the former, European empires could and did make legal claims to jurisdiction. In the latter, nations were permitted to extend their territorial boundaries only 3 nautical miles into coastal waters. Since 1982, under the United Nations Convention on the Laws of the Sea, territorial waters now extend 12 miles from the low water mark of a coastal state. The sea is figured prominently in patterns of migration and in border control practices, yet the materiality of the sea has received very little scholarly attention. Not all migration routes are maritime routes, but the current migration crisis is indeed a crisis of and on the sea. In the past 2 decades, it's estimated that 20,000 people have died at sea while trying to reach Europe from North Africa and the Middle East. In September 2015, and you've already seen this slide, but it's worth showing again, it was estimated that 3,329 migrants perished last year alone, though many suspect that the numbers are significantly higher as migrant deaths are often unaccounted for. As this graph shows, even the lowest estimates of deaths at sea represent a marked increase since 2014. The law of the sea has changed very little since Grotius wrote Mare Liberum, despite the extension of the 3-mile nautical limit to the 12-mile nautical limit. If the sea is free and common to all, if it can't be possessed, if it falls beyond national and territorial sovereignty, then who's responsible for these tens of thousands of deaths? This question became a topic of global news in April 2015, when 800 people drowned after a fishing trawler sunk off the coast of Libya. The 20-meter fishing boat collided with a Portuguese merchant ship that was actually coming to its rescue. Of the 800 aboard, there were only 28 survivors, and only 20 bodies have since been recovered. According to the UN High Commission for Refugees, 350 passengers on the boat were Eritreans. The rest were from Syria, Somalia, Mali, Senegal, Gambia, Ivory Coast, and Ethiopia. Black and brown bodies that continue to crowd the decks of ships. The captain, Ali Malek, a Tunisian national, and one of his crewmen, Mahmoud Bikit, a Syrian national, were charged with reckless, multiple manslaughter causing a shipwreck and aiding illegal immigration. Rather than situating the tragedy in a longer history of maritime violence, the ebbs and flows of migration from the global south, a direct result of colonial and imperial violence that makes places uninhabitable, and the effects of Europe's fortified borders, it was Malek's negligence that was blamed as causing the accident. Maritime efforts to create Fortress Europe, as well as the histories of occupation and displacement that precede it, were erased and obscured. Under maritime law, captains were held legally responsible for their crew and still are, and passengers and cargo. Under international law, states are responsible for migrants who enter their jurisdictional boundaries. Herein lies the problem of what I'm calling death by jurisdiction. More than 101 years ago, and not coincidentally, the key issues that emerged in the legal proceedings surrounding the Kamagatumaru had to do with questions of jurisdiction. Were the passengers British subjects? Were they entitled to enter Canada? Was the ship anchored in federal or provincial waters? I'm going to show you the same image that we just saw from Pender. Edward Bird and Robert Cassidy, the lawyers representing the Kamagatumaru and representing the passengers, argued that the ship was indisputably in Canadian waters. The vessel had landed in Vancouver Harbor and was well within the 3 nautical mile limit, but it was also within provincial jurisdiction. By being anchored in Vancouver Harbor, the ship had already landed in British Columbia and was already part of British Columbia. This was an ingenious argument. Bird and Cassidy insisted if the ship was already in Vancouver, then the laws of British Columbia, including those that guaranteed civil rights to the province's residents, were equally applicable to passengers aboard the ship. They could not be unlawfully detained as they had been. They could not be deported as they would be. The Immigration Board and the British Columbia Court of Appeal refused to hear this argument and others. The 5 appellate court judges unanimously agreed that the ship had landed in Canada but not in British Columbia. The passengers were immigrants who had no claims to civil rights. The passengers were British subjects, the court agreed, but exclusion was a founding premise of Canada's immigration laws. The Dominion was well within its jurisdiction to deport the Kamagatumaru, even if those aboard were part of the British Empire. Dominion jurisdiction trumped the province and the empire both. In many ways, the Kamagatumaru is no longer an exceptional story. Across the globe, migrants who arrive alive are denied entry, detained in immigration detention facilities, and deported. But there is something different. There's something jurisdictionally distinct about the contemporary refugee crisis. What is particularly alarming about the current situation of migrant deaths on the Mediterranean and in the South Pacific is how nation-states are mobilizing jurisdiction in other ways that are equally devastating to human life. One clear example is Australia. Its government has rescinded its jurisdiction from the waters where asylum seekers arrive. Under international law, this absolves Australia of any national responsibility for migrant lives and migrant deaths. Since January 2000, it's estimated that 1,955 migrants have died in and off the coast of Australia. The numbers are likely much higher. Apparently, 96% of these 1,955 deaths occurred at sea before vessels arrived in Australian waters. Most of the migrants seeking asylum have come from Afghanistan, Iraq, Palestine, Sri Lanka, and Iran, places that have long histories of American, European, and in the case of Palestine, Israeli occupation. These are localities devastated by the ongoing violence of colonialism, settler colonialism, and global capitalism. The US, Britain, France, Australia, Israel, and other countries are directly implicated in the migrant deaths at sea. Since 2012, Australia has established offshore processing centers in Nauru and Papua New Guinea. Australia has had a long colonial relationship with each of these islands, both were German colonies. After World War I, Nauru became a League of Nations mandate under the jurisdiction of Australia from 1920, and from 1920 to 1975, Papua New Guinea was administered by Australia. Both have consented to the offshore processing centers, and I'm using consent here lightly. In effect, these offshore centers have enabled the Australian government to process and detain migrants outside of Australia's territorial waters, beyond its jurisdiction. By stopping migrants before they reach Australia, the government is lawfully denying its responsibilities to asylum seekers under international law. The result is an increasing number of migrant deaths at sea and in detention. The current migrant crisis is being described as the worst since World War II. As the 2014 case of Ali Malik suggests, deaths on the Mediterranean are not deemed to be the fault of Fortress Europe, the US, or other countries who have no jurisdiction on the high seas, but the individual responsibility of young captains or of asylum seekers themselves, who should know the perils of boarding crowded and precarious vessels illegally. The Kamagatumaru Passengers, unlike the recent migrants who perished in the Mediterranean, all reached India. Several were shot at Budge, 19 in total. 2 died in the Alipore jail in Calcutta. There were no reported fatalities on the journey across the Pacific or on the ship's voyage along the Indian Ocean. This does not mean that the journey was easy or that it was beyond imperial and colonial violence. Many of the passengers left Punjab due to the land reforms initiated by British rule. They sought entry to Canada to begin another life. Many appealed to the Dominion government, chronicling the deplorable conditions they endured on their voyage to Vancouver, insufficient food and water, and filthy conditions aboard the ship. They pleaded to Canadian authorities to let them stay. Shall die in prison for 4 months, no bodily strength to cross Pacific. In July 1914, they were deported. On September 19, 1914, they arrived in Calcutta. So just to very quickly conclude, my objective in juxtaposing the Kamagatumaru's voyage with the contemporary migrant deaths at sea is not to draw an equivalence, but to insist on the legal significance of the sea in discussions of migration. The sea has a long history of legality, a racial history of dead and imperiled bodies, the deaths caused by slavery, indenture, and free migration. The sea is a history of colonial, imperial, and capital, and also state claims to jurisdiction, and more recently, its retraction. A site of violence that erases and disappears bodies, but one that we cannot afford to neglect. But the sea is also a history of freedom, struggle, imagination, and escape. This is a historical lesson afforded to us by the Kamagatumaru. It remains a historical lesson in the contemporary migrant crisis, but only if we can see the sea. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Marwani. Our next speaker is Melanie Hardbattle. Melanie Hardbattle is the archivist for Simon Fraser University Library's Special Collections and Rare Book Division, and serves right now as acting head of the Special Collections and Rare Books for the SFU Library, Burnaby. Graduating with a Master of Archival Science degree from UBC in 2000, she has worked for the SFU Library since 2009, during which she has served as a project coordinator for several digitization and community engagement projects, including the Multicultural Canada and Kamagatumaru Continuing the Journey websites, and more recently, SFU's commemorative event for the 100th anniversary of the arrival of the Kamagatumaru in Vancouver. Much of Melanie's work at SFU Special Collections has involved the preservation and making accessible of the documentary record of groups not traditionally represented in the archival record. Melanie Hardbattle.
I'd also like to thank Pinder and Em for organizing this event tonight. I'm very honored to be here as part of this event. As David mentioned, I've been very fortunate over the past few years to work as part of the team at SFU Library that's been constructing the Kamagatumaru Continuing the Journey website. And my work on that project has really inspired me over that time to consider how archives are constructed and the opportunities that are available to us to construct archives in new ways online as well. So tonight I'm going to be discussing how our understanding of and ability to reconstruct history is shaped both by the records that remain and the gaps, by what was deemed important to collect or include, and what has either been deliberately or inadvertently excluded from the documentary record. Until recent years, the archival record pertaining to early South Asian immigrants and would-be immigrants to British Columbia in the early 1900s that was most accessible to the ordinary researcher was for the most part created and shaped by those from the outside of the community. It was molded by the language and opinions of the government officials and media of the time, and the views of the individuals who determined which records should be preserved for posterity. As a result, we know a lot about the attitudes and prejudices that were faced by early South Asian immigrants, but less about who those first immigrants really were. Research in this area has involved interpreting gaps in this documentation and sifting through the biases of records creators. So, despite the fact that City Archivist Major J.S. Matthews lived only a few blocks from the Sikh temple in Kitsilano, records of the community did not make their way into the collection of the City of Vancouver archives or similar institutions. Looking online at Matthews' seminal work, Early Vancouver, which he published in 1956, I tried searching using various key terms and could only find 2 instances where South Asians were mentioned. And it was 2 mentions of Hindus, spelt Hindoos, and 1 sentence pertaining to the Kamagatumaru incident. In each of these instances, the mention was framed by the context of the British or Canadian-born pioneer whose story Matthews was recording. The main body of records at the archives relating to the South Asian Canadian community in Vancouver and South Asian immigration are those of H.H. Stevens, the Vancouver MP who opposed Asian immigration to Canada and who was heavily involved in the Kamagatumaru incident of 1914. The records in his fond are a key primary source of the information regarding interactions between the officials and the South Asian community in the years surrounding the incident. However, it is all documented from the perspective of the officials upholding the anti-immigration legislation that was intended to keep South Asians out of Canada. In the photographic record, we see rare glimpses of South Asians captured by the photographers who documented the city. As seen in this really popular Philip Timms photograph up in the left corner, which was taken on Granville Street in 1907, and the photograph at the bottom, which is the opening of the Granville Street Bridge in 1909, you can see that indeed early South Asian immigrants were participating in the daily life of the city. It's just proven very elusive for us to put together the details of who these immigrants actually were due to the gaps in the documentary record. So this became very apparent to me when, despite the fact that I've lived in Kitsilano for maybe 5 or 6 years, and I used to work at the City of Vancouver Archives for a number of years, I had no idea until about 2 or 3 years ago that there was a significant South Asian community that lived just within blocks of where I live. And I suddenly discovered that fact one day when I was looking through the city directories. The directories are a very significant source of information regarding those inhabitants of Vancouver who are not captured elsewhere in the archives, listing the names of the primary residents of each property, along with other valuable information such as occupation, place of employment, and in some cases the name of a spouse or children. South Asian Canadians first appear in Kitsilano Fairview in 1908, the year that the Sikh Gurdwara, the first in North America, was built at 1866 West 2nd Avenue. So on this slide, this shows the boundaries where the community was located in Kitsilano. It was boundaried by Granville Street on the east, Maple on the west, 2nd Avenue on the north, and then 3rd Avenue in the south. And you can see to the north of it was the First Nations Reserve, and then just up in the corner to the right were the various mills and kilns in False Creek where many of these men might have worked. So 1908 is the year following the anti-Asian riots in Vancouver's Chinatown and Japantown and the loss of the franchise for South Asian Canadians. It's the same year that the government was actively trying to persuade the South Asian Canadian population to relocate to the British Honduras. And the continuous passage regulation was enacted to limit South Asian immigration to Canada by denying entry to anyone who could not travel to Canada on a continuous passage from the country of their birth and who did not have $200 in their possession at the time of their arrival. Due to this legislation, the South Asian population in British Columbia declined from 6,000 in 1908 to 2,200 just 2 years later in 1910. And in this slide here, I had actually marked off all of the South Asian residences in green, and there's also a lot of Japanese Canadians that lived in the neighborhood as well, and they're in purple. And the arrow just indicates where the Sikh temple was. So what also made a very strong impression on me when looking at the directories is that while all of the residents of presumably British or European heritage are recorded by name, in some cases occupation is also included, their neighbors of a South Asian or Asian origin are completely anonymous, recorded only by their perceived ethnicity, that is, Hindu or Japanese, and sometimes simply foreigner. Here, for example, is the 1914 directory listing for West 2nd Avenue. You can just see several examples through there. As such, those controlling the documentation of this information appear to reinforce the general sentiment that these individuals are to be viewed as interlopers or outsiders. The use of the term foreigner within the directory further reinforces the refusal to accept these individuals as part of society. They are to be viewed as undesirable aliens or visitors from another country. In the alphabetical lookup in 1907, only 2 Singhs are listed in the entire city. Over the next few years, although the labels of Hindu or Japanese still dominate, there is a small growth in the number of individuals' names that make it into the street directory as well, such as S. Singh, laborer at Rat Portage Lumber Mill in False Creek and resident of 1678 West 2nd Avenue. However, in the years immediately preceding and following the Kamagatumaru incident in 1914, there is an evident shift back to identifying these residents solely by their ethnicity. This appears to start with the economic downturn in 1912, which led to an increasing fear of new immigrants competing for jobs. The media at the time surrounding the Kamagatumaru incident also promulgated the idea that South Asian immigrants were to be considered foreigners, and perhaps not genuine in their desire to develop new lives in Canada. When the Kamagatumaru arrived in Vancouver, the headlines began to encourage a fear of being overrun with South Asian immigrants with phrases such as Hindu invaders. Words such as tourists and excursion were also used to describe the passengers and their journey to Canada, serving to make light of their experience and to encourage a notion of the passengers and past immigrants as foreigners only temporarily visiting Canada. So in 2014, SFU Library was very honored to receive the generous gift of the archives of Arjun Singh Brar. He was an official at the Khalsa Diwan Society at the Second Avenue Temple, and he immigrated to Canada in 1926. And at that time, he took it upon himself to become a community historian. And one of the most significant items that we have in this collection is this diary, which records the entire history of the Sikh temple at 1866 West 2nd Avenue from 1906 until about 1947. And it not only documents the activities of the temple, it documents the activities of the community, and it names the community members. And it's also really significant in that there are some passages relating specifically to the issues around immigration. So there's quite a long section about the community's response to the proposal to send them to the Honduras. And there's entries discussing when the ship Kamagatumaru arrives and what the community's response is to that. So it's very significant in now bringing to light the response to these events. And something very important to note about it is that while the original was in Punjabi, we have since managed to get it translated into English. And we have both the Punjabi and the English versions digitized and available through the Continuing the Journey website. And the second item that I'd like to highlight from the collection is a passenger list in Punjabi. It was compiled by Arjun Singh Brar not too long after the actual incident occurred, and it was compiled with the aid of the community. So it includes information that is not in the official ship's manifest, and it also corrects some of the possible errors that were in the official manifest. So what we were able to do on the Continuing the Journey website was to actually integrate the original ship's manifest information with this new list, and also incorporate all the information in the reports that followed the Kamagatumaru incident. So if you go online and you click on a passenger's name, you can now have what is potentially the most complete listing of information about a passenger to date. And we're very open. Since the time that we put it online, we actually have been contacted by relatives of passengers on the ship who have offered to provide further information. So we're seeing this as a document that's going to continue to grow. So in conclusion, it is important to keep challenging the notion of what we consider to be unofficial archives. As records of the community become more accessible, our view of history is continually evolving and shifting. Our understanding becomes more inclusive and multidimensional, providing us with the opportunity to better understand the early South Asian Canadian community through new contexts. These individuals had names and occupations and families, and their role in shaping the city in the face of considerable adversity should be acknowledged. There are lessons that can serve us well in our own times as we ponder the issues and our own attitudes towards migration today.
Thank you, Melanie. I'm sorry. I feel, I'm afraid, I think you are. I may have left it in the room. How? Yeah, I don't have it here. I'm so sorry, Cecily.
just saved me. Thank you very much.
Cecily Nicholson, besides being magical with the iPhone, is administrator of the artist-run center Galerie Gachet, and she has worked since 2000 in the downtown East Side neighborhood of Vancouver, Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh territories. Her work, both creative and social, is often in collaboration with artists and educators. She currently facilitates the Surrey Teachers Association Teachers Writers Group and is an appointed member of the Ethics Research Board for the Emily Carr University. Nicholson is the author of Triage 2011 and From the Poplars, winner of the 2015 Dorothy Lively Poetry Prize. Cecily, and thank you for your visit.
Yeah, if that could just get moved, is that
Yeah.
possible, or, yeah, thank you. I'm trying to get a space.
I don't know how much that's.
Hi, how y'all doing?
Would this be any better for you?
Yeah, that's totally fine. Can you hear me okay? In the back, yeah, all right. I'd also like to echo an acknowledgement of the territory that we meet here, unceded Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, Squamish peoples. It's always a privilege to speak. I'd also always wish to shout out and think through and acknowledge, hey, Harsha, that's actually not where I was going with that, the downtown East Side community, close, nearby sometimes, and tonight I think in the room as well. It's a contradiction, a complication for me always to speak in this space, the Woodward space being instrumental as a gentrifying project and definitely impacting low-income housing stock in this neighborhood, and that's irreconcilable for me. I'm also here speaking, so I just want to kind of name that complicity because I'm present as well. I'm actually going to talk about the archive, and I'm also just going to offer some personal and anecdotal narratives about being a Black person and approaching those archives. I'm going to begin with what is, for me, a rather ubiquitous quote. No language is neutral, seared in the spine's unraveling. Here is history, too, a backbone bending and unbending without a word. And that, of course, is Dion Brand's from No Language is Neutral. I do thank the organizers for pulling this conversation together tonight. I feel there has, in many ways, been constructed this notion of a crisis, but I think many of us, if we are concerned through time, we know that this is not by any stretch a new phenomenon and is based in deep histories. I wanted to start off by talking about my first approach to an archival documents for the purpose of creative work. And this is about 20 years ago or over 20 years ago. And just to begin, approached a text called Born in Slavery, or not a text, sorry, a collection. Born in Slavery, Slave Narratives from the Federal Writers Projects, 1936 to 1938. This was an incredible first-person account for me of over 2,300 narratives of slavery, living people accounting for their experiences in slavery, and over 500 incredible to me photos, black and white photos of people. At the time, I was excited by the work. I attempted to engage that in a creative fashion and had very little critical faculty for what I actually was experiencing, interpreting, and not really understanding how that archive had come to be formed. So years later, thinking about it as the WPA slave narratives, so the Workers' Progress Administration narratives, so the possessive belonging to the project. I had thought about it colloquially, it's actually called that. And it's not until currently, until returning to, for the purpose of this discussion, that archive, that I realized that that actually wasn't the name of it. And that reading more about how those archives came to be formed, that the interviews were transcribed, that they were transcribed by interviewers who were not African American, who were not Black people. They're amateur, in some cases, writers. There were people not trained in phonetic transcription of speech. The instructions that they received from the editor in approaching the projects were varied and inconsistent. Their work failed to avert common stereotypes or derogatory notions of African Black idioms. And the result, as historian Lawrence Levine has written, is a mélange of accuracy and fantasy, of sensitivity and stereotype, of empathy and of racism. And the Library of Congress owns it when they say that the representations of speech in the narratives are as pervasive and forceful reminder that these documents are not only a record of a time that was already history when they were created, that they themselves were irreducibly historical, that the products of any particular time at any particular places in a long and troubled mediation of African American culture by other Americans. So it's probably maybe an obvious point to begin with a critique of an archival document and maybe to situate myself. It's also an integral moment for me to actually speak from a first-person perspective as a Black person approaching the archive, talking about migration. I find it very difficult, actually. I'm not quite used to doing that. But it's integral. It's an integral because what I understand, and what so many of us do understand, is that we're speaking into a history and a contemporary moment of continuous erasure. Skipping over some stuff. So, despite that erasure, nonetheless linked to material histories of Black migration, and I realize also to histories of Black aesthetics. And in this regard, I know that the archive, as ever, is always an unreliable source. To rely on it solely is going to be a problem because the archive is limited, the gaps. I appreciate that frame. However, the work in the archive is also necessary, and I do believe that is the case, despite the mediation of the texts. As Fred Moten, following Adorno, writes, to survive reality, it is at its most extreme and grim, artworks that do not want to sell themselves as consolation must equate themselves with that reality. So for me, the basis of a good poetics stems from the material. And when I say that I am concerned about materialism, that is to say I am concerned about meaning, which I don't know how many poets are in the room, but I've heard more than once in recent memory of people not concerned about meaning, concerned about meaning. And I have little patience for the attempts of non-objective art. There is a lot at stake right now. There's a lot at stake in terms of our ethics as we approach this work in the archive as well. I mean, it's been talked about tonight, but maybe I can review a little bit more, and maybe it's just for my own purpose of grounding in this moment. So we like to disconnect, and we look at history, looking at history is a way to do that, looking at other places is a way to do that. But all the issues that we are talking about are present, and we are responsible for them in this room as well. People migrate under pressure. I'm not sure this notion of free migration, maybe we can talk a bit more about your understanding of that, but people migrate under pressure, I think we can agree. As a result of conflict, war, genocide, starvation, climate disaster, combinations of all of these things. We can access information about Canadian allies and corporations like Goldcorp, who profit from displacement. It is a matter of public record who the Canadian state's allies are in terms of repressive governments. We can examine Canadian corporations like Nevsun, who are associated with the forced labor, propping up governments for business interests, and contributing to mass displacement. Migration has always so often been a matter of life and death, of wellness and malady. Immigration policies have made it impossible for people to travel here by regular means, thus risking their lives through precarious labor and travel. Deaths occur when people are detained indefinitely, without charge or trial, and that is what we do here, right? That's the regular thing that we do here. Illness and painful death occur without health care, so when we deny access to health care for hundreds of thousands in the Americas, that's what we do. That's a matter of Canadian state policy within our grasp. There are xenophobic actions on grand scales, and there is racism every day. There is substandard housing. We've opened the doors, so, and where are we going to house people? There are so many limits to access, not the least of which that here we are, always and ever speaking in English. And this experience, I shouldn't say always and ever. I've certainly sat in rooms, certain folks in this room where that is not the case, but this is the dominant way of talking about these things. And this experience, of course, is gendered, and there are constructions, this construction of a crisis that is absolutely classist and absolutely racist. We have an assessment, we have dominant constructions of who is deserving. So as organizers for the February 23rd event, African Refugees Highlighting a Forgotten and Excluded People, as they note, at some point, the refugee crisis highlighted some groups of people and erased Africans. That's February 23rd, 7 o'clock at the WASC Center for Dialogue. So I'm glum trying to talk about it. I'm trying to figure out what to do in terms of mediated text. I have a lot of experience since that earlier one approaching the WP, narratives, working with archives, and it's always been fraught. What to do with continuity of erasure, how to assert local narratives. How does the archive form in the marginalized person and collective bodies? How do we find ourselves there now? What are we replicating? I spent 2 years studying an island, so-called Poplar Island in the North Arm of the Fraser River. I didn't bring anything to read from it tonight because it doesn't explicitly contend with the complexities of migration. It touches on it. Say briefly about that experience that, so I was in the city archives, the provincial archives, the library, centered around New Westminster. I had limited time and access. I'm a full-time worker. I have other commitments, trying to do that creative work on the side. Nonetheless, the content that I garnered there was overwhelming. I had vast material to work with, and similar to some of the documents that you pulled up earlier, Melanie, in terms of looking at city records that seem banal, insurance or the listing of population or business ownership. That's where you start to find, you have to identify them, what's missing. But the effort to look at this idea, the surplus space, this constructed surplus space that seemed to have no meaning attached to it, to attempt to approach it with a methodology that I understood as an aspect of decolonization, to try to think through a history of land. I couldn't get through that door. That history wasn't present. It's not to say that history isn't present, but it wasn't in the archive. What I did have a saturation of was dominant narratives, European settlement, labor histories, the building of the railway, the construction of civic identity. I couldn't find the racialized histories of labor. I don't know what constitutes a grassroots archive, but I feel like that is something that needs to parallel this discussion. The notion of grassroots, it makes sense to me as an organizer, it makes sense to me in the context of community, in the context of academy and sort of formal discussions. I'm not sure how that works, but they must exist. I had a few more things I wanted to say in the vein of Black aesthetics, and I wanted to think through, in particular, M. Norbisi Phillips' song. I don't know, in terms of thinking through an approach to the archives and a melding of poetic and political intent, that there has been such a successful moment, certainly in my lifetime, in terms of a poetry book. In part because it's impossible to read in isolation. It doesn't actually make sense. It's very difficult. I don't know if you read the text, but it requires multiple voices. It defines itself more as a chorus and a coming together of collective voices. And that's, I realize what I belong to, but I'm not sure the degree to which that'll ever be contained in the context of the institution. Let me say one last quote. Fred Moten, relying on him a lot these days because he makes a lot of sense, particularly for the multiply displaced and homeless, chronically homeless body of the Black body, and attempting to understand, the context of traditional and ancestral territory, trying to understand these multiple histories of migration that somehow seem to be people want to compartmentalize as though it's not this deep and long-standing continuity. Anyways, he says that when Olson speaks of the sentence as the first act of nature, he does so within a general permission poetry takes, to push on and against that, to pass through the sentence and its passing, its having been passed, to submit the sentence to a terrible modality of passage, a horribly excluded middle passion. Philip's extra musical plea, her complex ply, her deeply wrought and incalculable ply, eternal, internal, discomposed, and a commutation of the natural sentence is the solo gone awry. Probably got a bit abstract there, but thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Cecily. I'd like to, we're going to have a discussion in a moment with the presenters, but I'd like to invite everyone to grab a drink or get some, there's a bit of food there, and bring it back to your seat, or perhaps step out for a moment if you need to. But we'd like to begin the conversation in a couple of minutes. We're asking people to do this because I believe there are time constraints regarding the food and the drinks. But grab a drink, something to eat, come back to your seat, and we'll discuss things. So this part of the evening, we're going to collapse them together, but this part of the evening we're envisioning as a discussion among the presenters. And I guess I'd just like to perhaps try to kick off the discussion by spinning off a bit from what Cecily spoke about, a project of going into the archive, and particularly for Cecily, how would you put it, recovering Black life from the archive. I just want to tell you a bit about a friend, a writer that I know. His name is Wade Compton. And I guess a lot of us in the room would know Wade's work. He's been involved for a long time in one way of approaching the question of the archive, of attempting to find and commemorate and preserve the record of Black life in Vancouver. And this is the records that or the evidence of Black life that he's hoping to, or has preserved, involves, of course, those fleeing slavery, those fleeing the aftermath of slavery, Jim Crow, and other sorts of migrations to Vancouver. The reason I'm mentioning this is because Wade has, through a variety of projects, the Hogan's Alley Project and whatnot, made manifest a Black life that people were not able to see as clearly before. But in one set of interviews, and he was doing an interview of people who lived in Hogan's Alley, which was a primarily or partially Black neighborhood in Vancouver, was essentially destroyed to build the viaduct. He was interviewing people who had lived in the neighborhood, and again, his hope was to uncover these layers of history, of forgotten history. Why? Wade's not really interested in just the plaque. Wade is interested in a form of cultural memory that will make us more attentive to the work of social justice right now. That's why he's interested in history. That's why he's interested in Black history. When he was doing this interview, And he kept on asking this person who had lived in Hogan's Alley, really beautiful and eloquent black woman, and kept on pressing for details of life in Hogan's Alley. And the person he was interviewing kept on saying, well, I think that's all I can offer. I can't offer any more. And she finally started to get almost a bit annoyed at the questions. This is how Wade describes this. And she finally looked at him squarely and said, well, what do you want me to remember? And the reason I ask that question is because I think in engaging in archival practices, it is not only what's clearly important, that matter of finding those historical records that are in danger of being lost, and that again rivet us to the task now, but also that dimension of our own will, our own ways of putting together the historical record that speak to our own creative practices, our own methodologies, our own sidedness in attending to the archive. And so I wanted to ask, I guess, the panelists to maybe clarify why do you delve into the archive? Why do you choose these particular subjects? Why does the Kamagatumaru occupy such primary kind of degree of interest of late for three of you? And what is that particular, the way that you engage with the archive, I guess?
That's a huge question.
Yeah, I spoke for too long, I think.
No,
Sorry.
you are not what you said. It's an enormous
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I have a shorter answer maybe, but I think to me, is the notion of accessing the experiential. So in a contemporary sense, if I'm wanting to engage in any social issues, I want to be accountable. I want to hear first and foremost, in terms of knowledge, I want to hear first and foremost from people who are directly impacted. The archive, limited and full of gaps as obviously it is one route to historical, experiential things that are tangible in terms of experience. So I think it is in part trying to engage whatever limited means we have to engage through history. Those of us, I mean, again, multiply displaced and experiencing that displacement in a contemporary moment are also at times seeking connectivity to a history that's been erased from formal processes of education, from dominant discursive frameworks that shape our everyday lives, and just the ways in which certain truths, certainly perspectives and facts based in time and place, are not accessible except through the documents, and, for example, in the archive. So I don't know.
I guess I would take a slightly different position, which is that, I see the archive as not just a site of gaps, but a site of deeply contested truths. And what's interesting to me is really the sort of historical impulse that not just historians, but people with historical sensibilities have, all of us, no matter how critical we are of the archive. It still materializes as the space that you can find things, that you can tell certain truths. I've written about the archive as a site of violence, right? That's where violence happens. By remembering something, you're forgetting many other things. And I think, it's not just about retrieval, but I think it is very much about the relationship between reading and remembering. And reading is not just about what is there, but it's always about the gaps and absences of, what haunts the archive, what shadows the archive, what's there but not there at the same time. And I think how one reads and writes is really critical, and remembers is really critical to the project of disrupting the archive.
May I just ask you something, just to pick up on the last point? Is it fair to say that your project, as it's turned in recent years, maybe developed, it's maritime history as archive, or more succinctly, the sea as archive, which is a really interesting thing, and when you consider how the sea is, as almost as anti-archive in the context of the Middle Passage and the way it's a really interesting notion. Was that fair?
Yeah, so actually I started my talk with Derek Walcott's The Sea as History, and then I took it out because I'm like, I'm on a panel with all these poets, and so I'm sure I'm going to get something wrong. But yeah, absolutely. It's, trying to think about the sea as a kind of archive, because despite the fact that its traces are not, the traces of what happens on the sea are not evident, right? There is a whole sort of set of accounting, juridical processes that go into mapping, what is suspected of happening on the ship, right, or on the sea. So all of these ship manifests, for example, ledgers, account books, all of these sort of banal documents that get produced, so there is like this overproduction of documentation around or on a surface that belies any kind of remembering in many ways. So I am really interested in that sort of tension, but I didn't feel that I had, I've been really thinking about this idea of oceans as method as opposed to archive.
Thanks. Pinder.
Yeah, I'm just reflecting on kind of the potential metaphor of that, and that is how do you bring in the invisible, and how do you bring in or reconstitute or replace that which has been erased and is surrounded by such an immense amount of silence. Dave, you were talking about Wade interviewing a person incessantly to speak to something that was around trauma, essentially, and I think that with doing the work with the archive as it relates to the Kamagatumaru, one of the sections in Dream Arteries is a letter to the Mara that I wrote about 20-something years ago, and even at that time it was really a kind of an interweave of various obscure historical documents and books, and specifically around the Punjabi Ghadar movement, which was the kind of left revolutionary Sikhs that were, and Punjabi secularists that were living in Vancouver. And the reason why I was trying to do that was because, and I'll just offer up some autobiography here, is that when you grow up with no identity, or you grow up with a kind of an identity that is continuously shrouded in kind of a seclusion, solitudinal space, and you become kind of very self-aware of your own color and really how ethnic you feel in the context of growing up in a suburb. That's what I was kind of driving towards. And the archive is rich in terms of kind of then navigating through all of the different trajectories, whether it be a colonialist frame or whether it be the revelatory interjections of the community into that space. So that if you go to the place like City of Vancouver Archives, you have everything digitized. You have all of these really beautiful surveillance images of the Kamagatumaru, the community, and then you have these documents that were all part of personal archives that then were entered into the official archive as a kind of again a replacing of a community's identity, right, and a reestablishment of a community space. my good friend Zul Solomon is over there, who published Rung magazine, and that's where the Letter of the Maru ended up being published in 20-something years ago. So thank you. But that's my relationship to the archive. It's really kind of a retrieval process, but also to engage in another conversation I'm having internally as a writer, and that is how do you break open, break down, fragment, refract that meta consciousness of the colonial mind, and then reappropriate it or appropriate it into the context of creative fiction or truth-telling through poetry.
Fantastic.
Well, I guess for me,
Is it?
Okay. I guess for me, as being an archivist, my duty on a daily basis is basically to ensure that we are preserving records, documenting historical events, people, places, activities, and then making sure that we make them accessible to the public while still maintaining the context in which the records were created so that they're trustworthy. They stand as trustworthy records. In terms of the Kamagatumaru, I guess through the whole process of working on this project, what really interested me was the process of discovery and finding out that so many records do exist in the community, and being able to engage with those records and bring them into the archives, being able to digitize them and put them online, making them accessible. And it's been really rewarding seeing these images that have come, images of the documents that have come to us in this manner, popping up in various projects and being used and coming up in new contexts. And it's just amazing.
Could you describe kind of a specific surprise that you that happened when I guess producing the website or receiving more information about the Kamagatumaru?
Sure. I guess one example I can think of is that in the course of the first phase of the project, I learned everything about the Kamagatumaru. So I knew everybody, all the key players in that. And it just happened that maybe 6 months or so later, we had a request for a photograph from one of our collections. So I was looking through this unprocessed collection, and I located a photograph that I had never seen before. And I was wondering, well, what is this photograph? I turned it over and it said, Funeral of Meiwas Singh. And Meiwas Singh is known as the individual who murdered immigration officer William Hopkinson after the Kamagatumaru incident. And it kind of just took my breath away because I hadn't actually seen that photograph previously. And I wrote a small article about the photograph, and since then it's been used quite a lot in different events and publications. Was it just last year was the 100th anniversary of the execution of Meiwas Singh, and the photograph was used quite a lot through all the commemorative material. So it was really nice to be able to see that photograph appear as part of the commemoration event.
Thank you. Perhaps one other broad question, and we should open it up for the audience. I'd like to turn to that question that's really one of the overarching questions, which is of migration. And I guess what I want to ask is about the nameless and the faceless within the representation of migration, and even migration emergencies as we are in one, as we are now. Cecily, you had in your presentation, I thought, a really important reference to Marlene Nobesi Phillips' book, Zong, which is, you could describe it as a book of incredibly brutal migration. Migration is death. And it is about, I hope I can maybe just offer a bit of background for those who don't know the book. It is about a book about slavers, a slave ship who threw enslaved people overboard in order to recover the insurance money. And the case was brought to trial, and forgive me, I forgot the perversity of the situation is that there was no charge brought forward for murder, only insurance fraud or something to that effect. Marlene Narbesi Phillip, not unlike many people, many poets, Pinder, precisely as Cecily, turned to the archive, this site of violence and pain. And but what could she find there? She could find no voice, no face, no name, really. What she had was the legal record, and out of the legal record to a certain extent, but then adding in other things, she was to create this poem, essentially by breaking it, distorting it, finding something else within that horrid document that could possibly indicate what had happened in that voyage, the deathscape of migration under slavery. I guess I want to ask the question about the nameless and the faceless at this particular moment, and how, I'm sorry, it's again another ridiculously broad question. It's like, it is ridiculously broad, but how representations of migration, even migration crises, when we finally get representations of those, they too can conceal, either reduce people to numbers or put a face to it that doesn't offer the full picture. What in your work reveals the nameless, the faceless?
Well, if we could be so bold to say that we succeed in doing that, I don't know, but I think just in general that notion of humanizing and what kinds of practices through poetic form can strengthen this humanizing perspective. And I also, what I like about that, and there is the footnotes of the names, but there is in Zong, but I think what I like about that text is it really is a very difficult book to read in isolation and to make sense in isolation. I don't think I explained that very well when I was talking about it earlier. And she's enacted multiple performative moments where multiple voices are reading, and that's when it starts to have this kind of salience that's, it's amazing and unusual, I think, in terms of our typical practices in terms of delivering poetry. But I think one thing I just wanted to take a very big step back and to say that it speaks to our lack of connectivity in a global sense when we have categories of people that are nameless. They're not nameless in another context, and I'm sure you've thought this through too, but they're not nameless in another context, and they're not without oral history or archive or documentation from another place and time. The fact is that we don't have these kinds of relations. Some people do. Maybe they move with mobility across these borders. Most of us don't. So we don't have these relationships through space and time to connect to where the name actually originates and where it's actually maybe still alive on people's tongues. You know, the nameless, faceless disappeared in the Mediterranean. I mean, they're still named and remembered faces, of course, right? So I think maybe just connecting that perspective that we have, this somewhat, and I would say in general, disturbed perspective in a city like this, and the ways in which we consume media, and we consume trauma, and we consume death, and that is a very vivid part of our everyday culture, and it's alarming, the normativity of that and the ways in which we can distance ourselves from that. So I think it's a moment for Zong in the 18th century, and it's horrible, and insurance, and they're horrible now. And so for me, I would love to see more of that connectivity in terms of time. But yeah, I don't know.
Can I respond?
Yeah.
So, I mean, for me, I think thinking about a legal history of the sea makes it impossible to think about migration without thinking about slavery. And so the text on the Zong has been so important and moving, not just Norby's Phillips, but also, there have been a number of people who have written very critically about it. And I think that, yes, absolutely, the people who perished, whether we're talking about the Atlantic or the Mediterranean, are humans who, despite how they were represented. But I think what is important to remember, and what I was trying to get at by juxtaposing the photograph of Alan Kurdi and the nameless, faceless masses of people on ships or in the sea, is the unrepresentability of that violence, right? And I think that the book on the Zhang really captures that. And many other scholars on slavery, I'm thinking of Saidia Hartman's Venus in Two Acts, right? Is what does the violence is really unrepresentable, even in the archive, even in its representation. It can't be represented. It has to be represented in absence. And I think the Kurdi and the nameless, faceless deaths on the Mediterranean or in the South Pacific or on the Pacific are really symptoms or indicators of the violence, not just material, epistemic, and the ways and, the limits of accounting for these deaths, like the limits of language for accounting, in terms of accounting for these deaths.
Yeah. I was thinking about, as I was listening, I was thinking about really the process of what informed me when I was writing Dream Arteries, and that was really the reality of the refugees in the dinghies coming from the Libyan coast, because that was primarily the point at which I was writing, and it's and the strategy that I used in terms of how I anthropomorphized the ship itself, and to kind of to build a narrative over a time period that's over a century, and then also connect it with the maritime migrations that have happened since the early 90s, like the Fujian ships from China, the MV Sunsea, that was here in 2012, I think it was, Sri Lankan migrants. These are the faceless. Punjabis were the faceless a century ago. The question of kind of accessing and then kind of bringing the archive into a community space has been a very long period of time. So representation, as it comes down to the current contemporary moment, we have the pleasure of having a progressive archivist who wanted to build and kind of move not just from the stark archival record of like a century ago, but to really kind of build another kind of narrative around it. In the 1990s, there was one plaque next to Canada Place for the Kamagatumaru. During that time, the idea of speaking to the Kamagatumaru was really in connection just to a very small coterie of people that were connected to the left culture, right, of the Punjabi community, which is really where the keepers of, in some ways, of conscience comes from. And to come back to Cecily's point about our ethical role in representation and around exploring compassion, humanity, ethical positions. I mean, that was something that was very real for me when I was in that writing process, because I was hoping that if there's a potential reader that has absolutely no idea of what these ship histories are, that they would reflect on the current moment in the contemporary space. And everything that they see on TV, or a person or a reader sees on TV, becomes that much more relevant and resonant. And that was kind of important for me. So in terms of representation, it kind of traverses many different places and trajectories. On another note, the approach I took was very controversial in the Punjabi community, because I used a very invisible technique, the apocryphal technique from the Bible, which is what stories get to be the official record of a certain sacred story. And the Kamagatumaru in the Punjabi community is the most sacred story. And connecting that to European migrants, or connecting that to the Sri Lankan migrants, or connecting that to the Chinese migrants, was a difficult one. So it's a question of like loyalty on representation, or loyalty in terms of community and what kind of community you think you are part of, right? So anyway, I'm just rambling here, but it was a difficult process for me to kind of own, but at the same time, it's an important kind of internal conversation one has about our own humanity, right?
Melanie, maybe just the last quick point, Melanie, in your, I guess sometimes in the context of the nameless, what we can find in the archives of migration is a face. And in your presentation, you offered me something that I'd been looking for, actually, for a long time. At the Vancouver Public Library, I once worked for the library, and they have the Inspiration Lab on the 3rd floor now, and they have on loop archival photos of Vancouver. And I noticed there are not too many non-white faces in that loop. And what you presented to me was, and now I have the tags, VPL 6781. I'm going to go to the library and say, here is a very interesting by Philip Timms. And people know this. And then there's another one, VPL 83421. I guess I want to offer my gratitude for these photographs. That again, there is a work that is done simply by having the face in, and it's not the end of the work by any means, but it is part of the work. Are those fairly rare photographs of, for instance, South Asians in early 20th century Vancouver photographs, or is that, I mean,
Actually,
in civic life, like in kind of civic, like not isolated in other contexts?
Actually, photographs are a real passion of mine in terms of the archival record, and I have done quite a bit of research in terms of the Kamagatumaru site in photographs that do exist portraying this early South Asian population. Right. Yeah, I've been trying to sort out for myself, like, were these just purely random photos that were taken and it just so happens that these people are there at the time and they're in there? Yeah. Or in some cases, is it more of a staged photograph, maybe sort of like a novel, a bit of a novelty to see a different looking person in the picture. So I've kind of been thinking about that a lot. There's not a lot of them. The libraries and archives have been really good in cataloging the photographs to mention that there are Sikhs or South Asians in the photographs, and that's how I found them. Okay. Basically, was just searching on those keywords. Okay. So that does say something as well, that they're actually, making the effort to include that information in the metadata, just because it is so hard to locate photos of early South Asian immigrants.
Thank you. I wonder if we have a...
we can take 3 questions.
Three? Yeah. Okay, yeah. Questions? Yeah, please ask.
We should probably try to do our best, never to... Right.
we should probably try to do our best never to have like a conversation like this in a Gold Corp sponsored facility, especially with like, Guatemala, Honduras, Argentina. They're all like, up for human rights abuses, hundreds of thousands of acres of lands that are inhabitable and, creating people that want sanctuary and the rest of it. And with the archive, like, Howard Zinn's People's History, Wretched of the Earth, they mean a great deal to me. But it's also, when I do my artist talks, that's when I lose the students, because it's the crimes of the father. They're not our crimes. All you have to do is look at Stan Douglas's mural that's over there. It's like, that was made exactly the time that Robert Zikansky was tasered at the Vancouver airport. He could have done that and made it our crimes, right? The Kamagatumaru has been brought up a number of times, and when I went to the Kamagatumaru, it was like really decadent event after decadent event where the moderator would say we have samoshes and pagodas and like, and if some of the energy or the courage of the people that actually got onto the Kamagatumaru would have been imposed on the 100-year anniversary, then we could have had something. And I've talked about it with Pinder and many other people that if Alain would have died half a year before or 3 months before, the Kamagatumaru would have been completely different. If it wouldn't have been different, it would have said something about us. So I find the Kamagatumaru a lost opportunity.
Sorry, I didn't hear what the last thing that you said. You find...
It was a complete lost opportunity. It was just too pushy and comfortable. As we have some great slides, and I appreciate the slide that you had of the people that were trying to reach Greece or whatever, and the casualties, because it brought it into the contemporary sphere, which I was kind of felt all in all was down. And the whole thing, like, office of community engagement. It's like, that's what Woodward wants to sell you, that they came here to engage with the community. They came here to be like the main gentrification. As soon as they get this space, then we get gentrified the rest of it. Give Bob Ryan a few drinks. It was more of a statement, but whatever you want to do. It was a statement. Good luck.
Yeah.
Collecting questions first.
Yeah, I just want to respond to the use of the term faceless and nameless a number of times this evening. And my sense is that it isn't, that those are wrong terms to use in a certain sense, because it's assuming there's a particular kind of representation that has legitimacy, and there are representations that don't. The migrants and the deaths that are occurring in highly localized spaces, and spaces that have histories built into them. And they have deeply complex oral histories, I'm sure. That these are not nameless and faceless people to the people who they relate to and their communities they came out of, and the little villages and the towns and the nations that they're fleeing from. And there are all these histories that are being archived at this very moment that escape us over here because we're so distant and we see things from such a distance, and we abstract them and we kind of see what's nameless when it's only nameless to us. That's all I'm just trying to say. And I was wondering if any of you have been looking at some of the photographic records of the migrants, experience of migrants, because online, as much as you kind of suspect the accuracy of photographs, there's some amazing photographs being taken by photographers who are in the context and shooting shots of people and kids and things like that. And they're very problematic images, but they still give you a deeper sense of the kind of complexities of life and in the migration patterns that are going on right now, that are escaping representation and making us aware that we know so little. Actually, so little actually it reaches our mediated eyes. So I just point that out. That's all. The severe limits of our own representational frames.
Thank you very much for your presentations. I was really struck, though, by the erasure of women in the photos and the names in the directories, in the probably the names on the manifest as well, and was a bit surprised that nobody commented on that. Were they not allowed on the ship to migrate in those times where they are now, so they're in more peril? Just hoping you can say a bit more about the gendered nature of the history that you were looking at, those who are looking at the boat. And you did a great job saying its name over and over, and I'm not even going to attempt it, because I'll get it wrong.
If my memory serves me correct, at the time there was actually legislation in place that the men that were over here could not bring their wives over. And that was part of the overall intention to limit people coming from the Punjab from creating families here and staying long term. So that would be why there was mainly men's names on the manifest. I do believe there were 2 women on the ship, and one was a doctor's wife who was returning. And I don't know very much about the other woman, but I recently had heard that there may have been a second woman. Yeah.
I just wanted to offer up a thank you for the interventions from the audience. I thought they were all really important. And I just briefly, again, just continuing this conversation, Roy, and it does devastate me, the notion of the non-representable and the faceless, because it assumes a gaze. And it also just the notion that this is applied or is something that we understand in the context of migration. This is how we understand whole bodies of people in whole places. Me situating myself here in this location. So it is a troubling frame that we've now carried through the whole presentation. One other thing I wanted to say briefly about the photography and the representations of current situations. I think there is some incredible work happening, and there's also, as often is the case, unfortunately, it's problematic in art world forms, but there's a drive to represent in the context of making art as well, which I don't remove poetry from that category. And there's been also some really interesting methodological responses, I think, from directly impacted spaces and communities. And I'm thinking, and I'm all I can remember is her first name is Tanis, but the group is Rise Refugee, who issued a really wonderful statement, and it's available online. And it's I think somewhat perfunctory in certain ways, because I think a lot about methodology, but still very useful, I think. Explanation and treaty, thinking about approaching refugee communities at this point in time for the purpose of art, and some of the tropes of savior mentality and the constructions of inferiority or impositions of time, and all of these things that happen when people capitalize on marginalization. At the same time, I think a very tense moment that also will produce some very critical work as well. I can't point to that critical work yet, but I do believe. My mic just got. Okay, there it is.
So as someone who is an analyst of colonial violence, I wouldn't disagree with what you're saying, but I think what I'm interested in is the ways in which this violence gets continually enacted and reenacted historically, in the present context, in the future. And part of what I was trying to gesture to was modes of abstraction, right? That it doesn't matter how many bodies we're talking about, how many people have perished, it's still a mode of abstraction, a form of numerical quantification that results in a kind of erasure or abstraction of human beings. And this isn't something that is just specific to migration. As I said earlier, it was a modality that was used to record the number of slaves for insurance on ships, for example. They weren't often identified by name or place of origin. They just became things, commodities to be sold. It's been a tactic that's been used to enumerate many populations, indigenous people all over the world, colonial populations. And so the point is really to point to the various forms of violence that we're confronted by. And I think that as someone who and it may have to do with our points of entry or our points of concern, that I am someone who has, who looks at state violence and how it's enacted. But thank you for your point. And your intervention, and thank you for the point that you made about the centenary events around the Kamagatumaru. I think that that's absolutely right on. I think that it's been interesting to see the ways in which the ship itself has been absorbed into a particular national narrative of redemption, of apology, of progress, of the triumph of multiculturalism.
That's great. Sorry, can you speak up just a bit more?
Especially talking with young people, because I don't really believe people are going to go back like 100 years. And just to see their posture and everything when we start talking about the Iraq War, or when we start talking about Haiti in 2004, right, which was like Canada, France, and the United States overthrowing democratically elected leader. When you look at the Iraq War in 2003, which if you look at Paul Solucci, who was the American ambassador, he has like pages and pages and pages of text, which is basically saying Canada was like contributed in more than 46 countries that were officially part of it. Paul Solucci says it was America, England, and Canada and Germany tied it out for third place to go into Iraq. And of course, Iraq is directly leading into Syria and the rest of it. So it's just like, it just seems like as a strategy, it would just be better or more effective to talk about what was happening in the last 20 years instead of going back, because I don't think young people are going to go back. And what Kendra, what you said, like I totally agree, like, it is a richer history to find out, like, like the colonial ships and the routes and all of that stuff, but I just don't think young people have so much information to absorb, almost as a strategy. You kind of have to, I don't know, just keep it with like names and faces that they might recognize.
I hear you with the kind of, I think this is actually a really interesting pedagogical approach, and I actually hear you. But certainly you're not saying that to go back and try to find the forms of relationships and the frameworks that may have contributed to this particular moment is a waste of time. I mean, you began by saying wretched of the earth, right? Right. Yeah, yeah, good point. Yeah, 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 yeah.
Like I appreciate, I put on talks as well, and invite guests and take people out. It's very problematic as soon as you start going down that road.
Right, right.
Being in the gold court or whatever, like no one's in this thing.
For sure. Yeah, no. Your point is a very good point. I think we might have to end it there. Thank you to all of the panelists. Thank you also to Amja Hall and Pinder Dulai for organizing this. Thank you all for attending.